Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. Thank you again for joining our webinar today, 2018, the Year in Review and a Look Forward, brought to you by Avenue Insights and Analytics. Today we have a high-profile panel of journalists who cover the local government space. They're well-versed in the issues, and they talk to sources all the time about critical issues that they grapple with. We'll talk about those, their outcomes, and what will continue to be front burner in the new year. So let's talk for just a little bit about who you have on the speakers today. I am Chris Orand. I lead the marketing organization within Avenue. We put together these informational sessions to keep jurisdictional leaders and staff apprised of key issues and insights to help you deal with them. Our speakers today, first is Andrea Fox. She is editor of EfficientGov. At EfficientGov, she develops and executes editorial strategy and research. She manages columnists and special projects. EfficientGov reaches mayors, city managers, town administrators, chief administrative officers, and elected officials in all 50 states. It tracks solutions to fiscal and operational challenges and showcases the policies and best practices for cost-effective government. Also with us today is Liz Farmer. Liz is the public finance writer at Governing Magazine, where she covers state and local budgets, tax policy, pensions, and more. Her writing is the driving force behind Governing's landmark series, Finance 101, which breaks down complicated public money issues, such as how some cities have become distressed or bankrupt. The series also features coverage on the politics behind pensions or the changing regulatory landscape for municipalities. So let's talk for just a minute our agenda today. I'll give you a short description of who Avenue is. We'll get into the issues. We'll talk about some of the surprises that the panelists have found in the last year, and then we can take some of your questions. So first up, who is Avenue? Avenue, we provide a variety of software and services to state and local governments, generally divided in these two areas. Under revenue enhancement, we provide discovery and recovery services that helps local governments find and claim new and untapped revenue sources, such as business license revenue. We do compliance auditing, where we identify and address patterns of noncompliance. We also conduct sales and use tax audits. Here we identify and secure sales tax funds that are due because of misallocations to other jurisdictions, for example. And we have reporting and analytics software that uses multiple data sources to create a more complete view of revenue and support revenue enhancement. On the administration side, we have a records management offering that includes software for maintaining official records, as well as digital records modernization that preserves and simplifies records. We have justice solution software for managing court and jury functions. We have an IT managed services division that provides help desks, disaster recovery and security and other services. We have property tax software and pension administration software, as well as unclaimed property solutions, where we do asset disposition through vehicles such as missingmoney.com. So that said, that's Avenue. Let's jump right into the issues here. And I want to start with the tax cut of 2017. Liz, let's go with you on this. What are you hearing about the effects of this a year after it passed the U.S. Congress?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and welcome to everyone who's joined. The tax cuts, the passage of tax reform last year really has done a number on budget officers in terms of trying to figure out how tax behavior is changing, how many of those changes have been just a one-time temporary move, and how much of that is longer lasting. And the biggest impact it's had so far is in those income tax returns. And what has happened is, in anticipation of tax reform, a lot of folks, particularly high net worth people, held off on filing taxes after the election and through a lot of 2017, thinking that they would get a big tax cut. And while one was discussed, and they did get one, it wasn't a very big one. The biggest break went to corporations. And so you had a lot of people not filing income taxes for a while, hoping, and waiting. And then in addition to that, you had this sort of surprise of this limit passed in tax reform on how much somebody can take off of their federally declared income of state and local taxes. And so that wasn't anticipated. So you had this kind of double whammy, people holding off on filing some of their income or declaring some of it, and then you had this additional kind of incentive now to declare as much income as you could, and so you could get a bunch of taxes taken off in 2017 before that tax break went away. So as you can see from the graph, that had the result of having this huge boost in late December and, of course, early January of a lot of people, filing income taxes then. And so what has continued on through 2018 is continued healthy, increases in income tax returns. So that has led people to speculate how much of this is just now a good, economy. And so overall what's happened now is state revenues have been very, very healthy. And you can see that it's been one of the better years since the recession. This recession has really been this delineating time in terms of, kind of what used to happen and is not going to happen anymore for state and local governments. And so since the recession, this particular last year was a good year for revenues. A lot of states and the local governments that can are saving that money and socking it away in rainy day funds.
Okay. Thank you, Liz. Andrea, what's your take on the tax cut status?
Hi, everybody. I was on mute. Yes, I was on mute. Sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. When I think about the tax cut, I think about how it can upset confidence in revenue projections to a degree, which makes it hard to be decisive and move forward on projects on the city level and the local level. But by mid-year, we were hearing that the tax cut was good for the muni bonds market. And right now, a lot of the financial publications are talking up muni bond investments. Last week, this chart that we're looking at, we can see that the muni bonds are now outperforming corporate debt, which is exciting to a lot of folks. And this week, Motley Fool posted a definitive guide to buying them. So I think we're going to see positive feelings for muni bond investments and what they can pay for over the next couple of years. So I think that is kind of a net positive from the tax cuts.
Okay, let's stick with revenue for a minute. In this next slide here, shows the report that the National League of Cities came out with earlier, just a couple of months ago, showing that revenue is growing faster than expense growth. What's the range of reactions you've heard about this? Liz, you want to take the first crack?
Oh, sure. So in terms of the national, are you talking about National League of Cities?
Yes. Yes, the League of Cities report.
Oh, okay. So there is what's happening with cities is there is, some cities are doing well, very well with revenue growth, as you can see. And what I always hear from the NLC is that whenever they come out with this report, there's the average and then there's the huge diversity between what's actually happening between cities. So overall, while cities are reporting these figures, what is true for one city is not true for the next. So in terms of what I am hearing the most when it comes to that, it's that there is this growing inequality between the haves and the have-nots with cities. And it's interesting to me, I think, that the Amazon's choice to split its headquarters between New York City and a suburb of Washington, D.C. is a really great example of, those were kind of the two most obvious choices without this huge year-long, bonanza/contest for Amazon's business. And Amazon went along with what was kind of the obvious choice, the two extremely healthy cities. Amazon's not going to have a lot of economic impact as much as it could have there, say, as if it had gone to Columbus, Ohio. And I have a couple of stats that sort of illustrate this. One is that in Pennsylvania, for example, its population has grown almost 1% over the last 5 or 6 years, but 2/3 of the state's 67 counties have actually lost population. So you're seeing that kind of growing disparity between the trending towards urban areas and rural or less populated areas continuing to miss out, and that is causing many of those counties to have legacy costs like pensions and retiree health care costs increase, and now they don't have the tax base to support it. Credit rating-wise, we're again seeing that some cities are continuing to do well, but by one measurement, 20% of state and local governments have actually seen their underlying credit quality decline since the recession. So again, you see this divergence with how cities and localities are doing.
Thank you, Liz. Andrea, from EfficientGov, what's your take on this NLC reports and the revenue outlook?
Well, I think Liz raised some interesting points about legacy costs increasing, tax base falling, and then this idea that expenses are increasing. In addition to pensions, one of the key items is infrastructure costs. And it strikes me that what a contributor, Jen Mayer, who is a facilitator with the Living Cities City Accelerator program, said about 1 year ago could become actually a growing trend in 2019. One of the three things that communities can do to increase revenues to finance infrastructure costs is to monetize assets and seek to create revenue from development of underutilized sites. But to Liz's point, that effort often results in increasing disparities between the have and have-nots. If you look at the next slide, I have 3 images here from High Point, North Carolina. And these came from Strong Towns, which is a group that has limited engagements with various cities throughout the country, and they do a lot of research on financial productivity comparisons that are measured in total value per acre. And as you can see here, these large projects, the Walmart and the Kmart, they don't they don't produce the wealth that traditional urban patterns do. As you can see, Jimmy's Pizza House is the winner here. This small property in High Point, North Carolina, is a higher producer and a greater example of wealth. The group has found this pattern repeated across the country, and what the lesson here is that organic growth through traditional block-by-block development generally creates a tax base that can afford maintenance of needed public assets and services, where the Kmart and the Walmart and the other big box, large type developments, the funding often runs out to take care of the assets over time. And that's why we're seeing a lot of expenses increase and the revenues just aren't there. A lot of these big developments get tax breaks and everything else. And in the long run, it's the municipality that is struggling to pay with its expenses.
Thank you, Andrea. Let's talk briefly about the sharing economy, sometimes called the gig economy. Some jurisdictions have made headway on regulating and taxing the Ubers and Airbnbs of the world. And Avenue has actually been in discussions with Airbnb about voluntary collection agreements in some jurisdictions. So there is headway being made in that direction. But what's happening more broadly with regard to this? Liz, your take?
Yeah, I think as localities have gotten more experience with the sharing economy, particularly with the Ubers of the world and the Airbnbs, they have started to see how it's had an impact on their overall market. And what I mean by that is that there's a growing body of evidence that the ride-sharing industry is actually worsening congestion in cities and taking potential customers away from public transit. And meanwhile, there was recent research out of the University of Massachusetts that looked at areas in Boston and found that the areas with the most Airbnb listings also had the highest rent per month. And so, again, so what was meant to, kind of make something better for consumers has contributed to making it actually a tougher market in both of those respects. And so cities are, as you mentioned, Chris, I mean, cities are figuring out ways to kind of link up and start taxing these ride-sharing and house-sharing things as a service. One thing to note is that Massachusetts has plans to apply its state hotel tax to short-term rentals, and it requires at least a small portion of that to be labeled impact taxes, and wants to funnel that revenue to help fund investments in affordable housing or infrastructure. And so you see this diversion of a piece of that tax revenue going towards maybe trying to help kind of counteract what is now becoming an even worse problem. The same is happening. New York City is a good example of a city that is taxing ride-sharing services and trying to funnel that revenue back into public transit.
Yeah, interesting. Of course, traffic. A lot of issues that get tied up into this. Just in terms of the Uber and Lyft. There's in Airbnb. There's noise, health. Beyond the traffic, land use. All kinds of issues get thrown in the mix here. Andrea, what's your reaction to the state of the sharing economy?
I think more states and cities and counties are working with Airbnb and others that we've mentioned on short-term rental tax agreements in order to generate revenues. And they're looking at how Airbnb reports data, how short-term rentals affect rental markets and neighborhood quality of life, and they're putting some restrictions around that. An additional example is in Vancouver, British Columbia. They only allow short-term rental on some or all of a principal home, but they will actually prohibit the rental of a secondary residence, an accessory dwelling unit, a granny apartment, or a backyard cottage. They'll actually restrict that in order to maintain a piece of affordable housing for renters. And then the third thing cities are tackling is how to impose rental caps to both streamline the burdens on less frequent hosts, as well as to preserve those rental supplies. Washington State has several cities that each have varying rules, and one city requires ADUs to be rented for a minimum of 90 days or more. So they actually take Airbnb out of the equation while still working with them to have access to other properties for short-term rental.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's turn our attention to an issue that was very popular, at least from the Avenue perspective, in 2018, the Wayfair decision. Earlier this year, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that online sales can be taxed, and there's been a surge in interest on how to capture that revenue. Liz, would you say this has been fully settled yet?
Well, never say never, but whereas a few months back, before in the months following the decision, I had heard a lot of chatter, particularly around states like Colorado, that have really complicated taxing structures, meaning that 3 different tax rates could apply to one transaction if there's a special district and a municipal tax and a state tax, all applying to one purchase. It's incredibly cumbersome for out-of-state retailers to comply. So that there very well could be a follow-on lawsuit regarding that. I just have not heard a lot of conversation about that for several months. So conversation seems to have died down, at least for the moment, as to whether or not there will be another legal challenge regarding the Wayfair decision. But as for now, what I can say is that about half of states have implemented some form of have started collecting sales taxes from out-of-state retailers for online purchases. And we don't have any big numbers yet, but I think that it'll be interesting to look at this in a few months, seeing if there was any impact with this holiday season and whether or not the sales tax, has made a difference. My prediction is that, and this is a prediction of several other people I've spoken with, is that for all of the talk that states especially have done in the last decade or so trying to get this passed, there has been a lot of headway made by online retailers in terms of starting to fork over those taxes anyway. Amazon is the biggest example. They have agreements in most states now where people are paying taxes on for Amazon purchases anyway. So I think there's not going to be as big of a revenue boon as perhaps people would have expected when they first started this fight, but I think you will see a difference. And the last thing to note is that roughly a third of the nation's populace still doesn't live in a state where they're applying this, because California, New York, Texas, and Florida have not started taxing out-of-state retailers. So those are obviously four very huge states that could have a real big impact here on the numbers.
Sure. Andrea, your thoughts on Wayfair?
I agree. I think there's a lot of wait and see here. It doesn't seem like Congress is going to look to codify any sort of national policy on it, but there is a concern for small business, and I think some states are going to pause to think about how they can collect taxes and not hurt small businesses. And there are already some congressional proposals to act to protect small business, but there hasn't been a lot of discussion anytime recently.
Okay, very good. Let's talk briefly about just the current state of the economy. You pick up a lot of opinion pages these days, and you get some people talking about how we're near the end of our current and lengthy period of economic growth. The parallel thought of that would be that recession's right around the corner. What are you hearing on this as it relates to governments? Like, for example, what regions might be best or least prepared for the next recession? Liz, you want to take the first crack at that?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's interesting that we're talking about this given the week that we've had in the last week and continuing into this week with the market. And one thing, I wrote a story last week about what to look for, how states can prepare or what they should be looking for in the next recession. And the person I spoke with reminded me that the stock market is not the economy, and that, they, as much as it causes people to panic, the numbers at the state level are so far holding very well. As I've mentioned, revenues, still been higher level of revenues than it has usually been. Some of the biggest indicators to look for are unemployment insurance filings and Medicaid spending for states at the state level, because those are usually two of the biggest, kind of canaries in the coal mine, and those are all holding normally so far. But when it does hit, it seems to me that the regions that are best positioned are the ones where there is a steady and growing working population, and therefore a better tax base to support whatever happens next. And that is generally in the South, and the South and the West are positioned best when it comes to those figures. The Northeast, largely because of aging, might face the biggest problems. A lot depends on how much governments have stored away in their rainy day funds, and and how they approach revenue dips. I'm thinking a place like Connecticut is probably the most vulnerable because it is one of the states that has the oldest population, and it does not have very much in its rainy day fund. It has only started putting money back in there. So the Northeast might face the hardest impact and recovery, whereas the South and the West might be in a better position.
Interesting, yeah, and I know Connecticut has had some fiscal challenges for a number of years now as well. Andrea, what are you hearing about the potential for recession and panic in the streets?
Well, so there's no well, there's no projected increase in the inflation rate for 2019. It's going to stay about the same as last year from what some of the projections I've been hearing about. Recessions can affect things like muni bonds, but so far there's not a lot of indication because of the inflation rate, and I think that's another reason of late for the positive talk on these investments. So you may see some areas affected by recession, but projects are still moving forward. I think one of the critical areas to consider is with housing and the real estate market. While foreclosures and mortgages underwater are generally down, most notably in Las Vegas and Florida, some places like the Lakes regions in the Midwest have never actually recovered median home values. And now with house prices softening and we're seeing inventory increases even in some complicated hot markets like Seattle and San Diego, I think job loss associated with recession could actually push foreclosures in some markets, which would affect the tax base. Places like Colorado that have high medium home prices and fewer high-paying jobs, they already have unemployment trending up. That could foreshadow a struggle during an oncoming recession. And cities with already high foreclosure rates like Baltimore would be further affected.
Very insightful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's talk for a minute about some operational issues. Obviously the economy affects every issue, but there are many issues by themselves that can take a substantial amount of focus and require the deft hand of leadership. How do you see these issues that got the most of government's attention in the last year, and which ones are going to stay front and center in the new year? And I'm referring to the ones on the screen here of opioids, healthcare, public safety, infrastructure, and community engagement, and others that may come to mind in as you remark on these. Andrea, you want to take the
Yeah, absolutely. So opioids, something I cover extensively on EfficientGov. The costs and the impacts to public safety, public health, and the criminal justice system are just extensive, and it's a widespread problem, and that is definitely going to stay in the forefront, for the foreseeable future. Healthcare is another area where rising with Medicare cuts, as well as the need to better integrate data for impacts like opioids, you're going to see a lot of attention there. Healthcare budgets are growing in some major cities, and there's a lot of things that are going to fall to local governments to take care of as healthcare funding is falling away. Public safety and emergency management, local governments are spending more on drones, on law enforcement technologies, on ensuring power for IT operations. If you go to the next slide, I have the what they're spending. Counties are already, might be a bit ahead, sorry about that. Counties are already spending more of their technology budgets than cities and states on telecommunications, and that's going to increase with national next generation 911 efforts. The costs for that are estimated between 9.5 and 12.7 billion over the next 10 years. So you're going to see a lot of spending on the local level. There's going to be a lot of funding for that as well, but that's going to be increasing area of attention. And then, of course, infrastructure, which you've talked about before and we'll talk about again, is still very critical. And then finally, community engagement and digital modernization on both the local and the state level in terms of records management and everything else, citizen expectations of digital modernization. That's here for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, echo that in records management. We hear that a bit here at Avenue as well, and the importance of it, and the need to digitize and get rid of paper and decaying film and things like that, just to comply with statutes. What about workforce? Andrea, what's being done in governments to sort of train employees and groom tomorrow's administrators and ensure that institutional knowledge is retained?
So, if you're looking at a lot of industries where we're experiencing the silver tsunami, and some local governments are establishing mentor-based workforce training programs to pass on institutional knowledge. The City of Atlanta is doing this for their code enforcement. It's a training and recruitment program. We might see more of that in water utilities, where there is a new federal funding mechanism, $1 million per year grant program for workforce development under the Water Infrastructure Act. So, there's a need to pass on these sort of essential skills. Training is critical from the most basic level, such as making sure your local government has a social media policy, to advancing technical knowledge for across teams in several areas of government to ensure compliance and, just make sure that things are running smoothly and efficiently and accomplishing goals and lowering costs. To address the flight of talent to the private sector, which is another issue, you've probably noticed a lot of these chief technical officers and other folks that have a lot of technical skill are leaving government and going into the private sector. So local government is looking at things like addressing salary compression, offering innovative benefits and work time flexibility, and just encouraging passion for public service in order to, keep a skilled workforce.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk for next about technology. I mean, you talked about, how things are getting done, and of course, hardware and software these days are the engine behind many operations. Address how well cities are adapting to the cloud, using data, preparing themselves against threats, and just general use of technology. Liz, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, just kind of spinning off a little bit on what Andrea was talking about in terms of finding quality people to stay in government. One of the things that city and county CFOs say they have the hardest time doing is finding quality IT directors, and so that goes right into this question of technology. And I think Atlanta, the ransomware hack on Atlanta earlier this year was not necessarily surprising, but a big wake-up call because of the size of the city, and also for how long it took to get everything back online. I mean, you're looking at revenue and fee collecting systems that were offline for weeks, and so and the city is still playing catch up in terms of how to make sure that it's collecting everything it should have. And not only is that a pain for the people who work for a city, it's a pain for people who have to pay money to the city. So just something like that, no city wants to have that happen to them. And you are seeing some more investment in things like ransomware insurance and that sort of thing. But to be sure, finding someone to run it has been the biggest problem. I mean, I'll just give you one example. Washington, D.C., major city that we probably are all very familiar with, has gone through 5 IT heads in 4 years, and so they just cannot keep the staff. So that's what I'm hearing the most about.
Okay, well, good job security or bad job security, depending on your perspective, I suppose. Andrea, what are your thoughts?
So I think, adapting or transitioning to the cloud, using data to make better decisions and to address cybersecurity, these are key issues across the board, and cost and comfort are considerable factors in modernization. There is a fear of overbuying and underutilizing technology, as well as, just being sure that those assets are secured, the data and private information, isn't released by an oversight or, some sort of attack. So, governments are going to be looking at how they can accomplish these things with some assurance. So they're going to be relying on, vendors and security partners and advisors to kind of walk them through those steps. But I think the areas they're going to be focusing a lot of technology spend, as you can see on the graph, is the emergency telecommunications. Government clients can't worry about the location of telecom resources, and these are all going to the cloud. The telecom side is all going to the cloud as well. They're also looking at community engagement applications to improve decision-making and government transparency. We have a younger population that is moving into its prime, and their patience for legacy systems is waning. There's also applications like healthcare and telehealth. There's opportunities there, sort of to improve the citizen experience. And then finally, data integration between government departments is going to become critical. Citizens just don't recognize government silos, and they're going to be less understanding as time goes on. So government departments on the local level, Public Works and the Health Department, they're going to have to work together. And we're already seeing a lot of data sharing, in some cities in terms of like the public health data feeding anonymized public health data feeding public safety systems. And, there's opportunities there for decision support as well. And I think you'll see a lot of things coming in the next 5 years that are going to change the way that governments operate.
Yeah, it's interesting. IT staff, I can certainly understand how that's the highest cost. The hierarchy here makes perfect sense. Hardware, I'm always been just intrigued by the statistic that most PCs have like a 3 to 5 year lifespan, and governments are working well beyond that. Which does make a pretty good case for kind of figuring out how to do things differently and use some of these newer technologies in the cloud. Okay, let's see. We're going to talk about what has surprised you in the last year. I'm sure you see lots of things come through your inbox and across your desk that you expect. What was some of the things, like the November elections, for example? Did anything in there surprise you at the ballot box? Liz?
Yeah, I think I cover a lot of the state and some of the local tax-related ballot measures. And in general, you saw this theme of cities and counties in some places opting to raise taxes on themselves, but that's much harder to achieve at the state level, and so you didn't really see any statewide ballot measures where the tax was raised. What surprised me, though, was the one in California, where it would have been an expansion to a 40-year-old constitutional amendment called Prop 13 that basically limits the increase of property taxes for long-term homeowners. So if you live in a home for 30 years and you live in California, your property taxes are very likely to be well below what they should be. And so that ballot measure would have expanded that benefit and allowed people to take their reduced taxes with them when they move, and voters turned it down. So that was a big surprise to me. That has traditionally been something that does well. And so and the other thing that I think surprised me overall is regarding education. I've covered education funding for years, and I'm always hearing about how states are underfunding it and sliding on further down since the recession. And this year we finally saw the backlash, again, largely at the state level, but we saw teacher strikes, and these were very true blue grassroots efforts. These teacher strikes or walkouts happened in states where there isn't a strong union presence, like in West Virginia or Arizona, and in Oklahoma. And so, and you saw legislative response to that. You saw legislators, especially in, I think, Oklahoma, where they passed the first tax hike, where the legislature passed the first tax hike in almost 30 years, all in response to this. So, teachers got raises, not as big as they had asked for, but it was that was a big surprise to me that you finally saw some movement on there.
Okay. Andrea, what surprised you in the past year?
I thought infrastructure would move a little quicker. It was a promise made to local government even prior to the inauguration, and it was to be a third agenda item after healthcare and tax reform. I think a big part of that is transportation has not been a priority for the Senate. So when I think about where it's at now and I look at the election, what was so interesting to me is that in 2018, public transportation won 30 of 36 ballot measures in elections. And just in November alone, voters passed 17 of 20 transportation-related ballot measures. We've got cities like Los Angeles just forging ahead with transportation innovation partnerships. At the same time, we've been watching federal funding for public transit dwindling. The American Public Transit Association has been very concerned about this. But then in the last couple of days, we're actually starting to see some funding come out of the administration. The BUILD grants, which replaced the Tiger grants, and some of the FAST Act funding, which is for public transit. We're starting to see announcements about that just in the last few days. So there's more rural and rail and road focus, although some public transit projects are being funded. So when I think about all this, 2018 is just a breath from 2020. So I think that we're going to start seeing some infrastructure building taking over the headlines if the government doesn't shut down.
Very good. Thank you very much. I am now reaching the point where we're ready to take some questions. We've got a few that have come in via the chat feature. If you've got some, I encourage you to send them in. We'll talk about this first one, and I think this one's anybody's ball. With regard to the innovative benefits mentioned to attract and retrain a public sector workforce, what are two specific examples of innovations from local governments? I'll leave one of you to decide which one is better suited to answer that.
I can.
Yeah, I'll send to Andrea.
I can go for this a little bit. So innovative benefits, I mean, typically, City Hall hours are pretty structured, but there has been, I don't know if I can name a specific city, but when I was at ICMA a couple of months ago, I did attend a session on compensation, and there are opportunities now that they're seeing more of government employers offering workplace flexibility. So there may be days where some folks can work longer hours into the afternoon. Maybe they have days where they can work from home. Another example that I thought was really interesting is they have like some pet care reimbursement. So that was another way to sort of diversify attractiveness as an employer.
That's kind of cool. That's a different benefit. I had not heard that.
Yeah, not everybody has children. A lot of people have pets, so they're offering, in lieu of health care benefits for dependents, they have pet care benefits.
Very interesting. What about, here's another question that's come in about Amazon's headquarters 2 search. How much was spent to attract them, and has there been any pushback about the time and money that governments have spent to lure them?
I can take that one. So there has been no, and I don't anticipate some sort of overarching figure, but I mean, it's fair to say, tens of millions was spent easily on just when you consider the time, the thousands of hours, the back and forth, particularly when some cities kind of mailed it in when they placed their bid, but this was a very serious exercise for more than 200 cities initially. And then when you narrowed it down to the top 20 cities or regions, you're talking about numerous presentations, development, further development of their bid, lengthy responses to questions from Amazon officials, site visits upon site visits, and so you're talking about a lot of time that was devoted to this. And as me personally, and in my reporting, I've seen a lot of complaining about it, and there has been pushback, as many people probably seen from some of the newly elected officials coming in from the New York City area. But the pushback has generally been not on the amount of time spent, but just on now worries about congestion, kind of all those sort of traditional things that you worry about when a major employer comes to your area, I guess, other than the number of jobs that they'll bring. But the spin I have been given, and so you can take it for what it's worth, is that this was in some sense a valuable exercise for cities. That this is kind of a good to kind of go through this process, and now they've got an amazing, a bid to repackage to other corporate and potential employers that should they want to do that. But that's it's all largely theoretical. I mean, we'll see what happens if cities are actually able to kind of, make lemonade out of lemons.
Andrea, any input on that?
Yeah.
If not, I have another one for you.
Yeah, no, I definitely have been following this process for a long time. And, there were many people who had their guesses and their suspicions, and there was so much effort put into this. And, the amount of data that Amazon got from each of these applicants, it's almost genius for a company to say, put something out there and get all this information just handed to them without any effort on their part. So now Amazon has this trove of data from cities across the country, to make its decisions. So it might have been a worthy exercise for some cities to participate, but I think what I'm hearing is a lot of them feeling like, why bother? Because we just lost to folks that are the obvious choices anyway, and we've just spent all this time and given them all this information, and we can't compete. And I think they have concerns about how they're going to attract the workforce of the future.
I have one last question that's come in. It concerns pension funding. This has been dismal for a while. Has that changed at all? Are there any bright spots in the pension funding outlook?
I'd say that whatever was true about 4 or 5 years ago remains true today. So as always with pension funding, there are states and cities and localities that have had very good practices. The state of Wisconsin, I believe, is pretty much fully funded. New York State is another state that has a well-funded pension plan. There are many, despite the headline in California, there are many cities there that have a healthy pension plan. But there are also many that don't. I mean, I could name all the obvious ones, but I think what has happened with pension funding is that governments just have not been able to keep up with putting in with their liabilities. So while the stock market pension returns have been pretty good the last few years, just the fact that governments continue to have to put in more and more money because they're starting to reach the shift of having as many retirees as they do current working employees. So the burden is weighing heavier on those payments going out rather than the payments coming in. You're seeing that that's not going to change. I mean, we talked about the aging population. I think this CalPERS, the largest pension fund in the country, if not possibly the world, has already gone kind of inside at cash flow negative, and so because of the number of retirees it's making payments out to. And so while pension plans were in some senses built to withstand that, it all depends on how well the discipline is in terms of putting money in. And so, not much has changed. The governments that were poorly funded a few years ago remain poorly funded and are only getting worse.
Okay. Andrea, any final comments on pension?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's just a lot of kicking the can down the road for several years, and these are really difficult conversations. The ones that are having success, the Wisconsin, South Dakota, Tennessee, Nebraska, New York, they've sort of addressed their risk sharing scenarios as well as their funding mechanisms. And, these are conversations that folks are going to have. Just ask Dallas Mayor Mike Rollins. He's been able to get the public safety unions to agree to some reforms, but it hasn't been a pleasant battle for him, I'm sure.
Okay, well, that is about the time we had planned on. Those are all the questions that we had. I want to offer my profuse thanks to Liz and Andrea for participating today. I encourage everybody on the phone here to go to governing.com and to EfficientGov.com and follow follow Liz and Andrea. Follow them on social media. They've always got something insightful to say, and I always do it myself. So I also would ask everybody to keep an eye out on your inbox in January. Our next webinar we're expecting is going to be on cannabis management and how jurisdictions can get a handle on that. So that will be happening probably late in January. Thank you once again, everybody. Wish you happy holidays and great success in 2019.